Good morning, everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of Fires and Grading. I'm Becky Pepler, and I will be your host today, and we are so glad that you were able to join us. Whether you are maybe on summer break and that has started for you, or maybe you're just nearing the end of the school year, we appreciate you taking some time to join us for another important topic on grading reform. You know, as educators, we're always looking for ways to be able to streamline our workload and be able to focus on what's most impactful. And one common question that we hear all the time, at least when we're working with schools around prioritizing standards, making those standards make sense, developing those learning targets and observables, a common phrase we hear is, can't we just use someone else's priority standards and learning targets? And hasn't somebody else done this? Why do we need to reinvent the wheel? And, you know, at first glance, this seems like maybe a really smart shortcut or a way to save time and some of our efforts. But many educators have found that borrowing those standards and not doing that work on your own can lead to some unexpected challenges and mismatch expectations. So today we're going to dig deep into exactly why doing the work ourselves matters so much. And to help be able to unpack and bring some light and shed some light onto this issue, I'm super excited to have Garth and Don here with me today. How are you guys both doing today?
Fantastic. I'm super excited to dive into this. I really want to know, Don, how are you doing this morning for people listening live right now? I think Don's going on about an hour of sleep, maybe if that.
Yes, absolutely fantastic, Garth. As we was working with a school yesterday over in California and got to take the red eye back and drive home from Chicago this morning. So feeling chipper is how I would describe myself this morning.
Chipper is a great way to describe
Yeah,
it.
excited to be here. I'll tell you that. So
Garth, how are you doing this morning?
Great. I'm excited to, interestingly, Don is coming back from California. Becky and I are flying out to California this afternoon. So glad that the three of us could make it work, and appreciate those of you joining live right now for a morning session. This is our first morning opportunity of running this show. So curious to hear feedback on when is the best time for people to be able to listen. Or again, as always, we appreciate you listening after the fact.
Yes, well, thank you both. And with that being said, let's jump right in. I know all three of us have heard this comment very often as we're working with different schools across the United States. And, you know, and I think there's some validation to the question at first. Like, we can't doubt people for asking the question, you know, as we sit down and we start digging into standards, especially when, you know, sometimes like states have adopted sets of standards and we sit down and we're like, well, didn't the district next door just do this? Like, can't we take their priority standards? Why do we have to do this? So, Don, I'm going to start with you and kind of thinking back to some of your experience. What do you think is kind of the root to this particular fire? Like, why are teachers often drawn to the idea maybe of borrowing somebody else's priority standards rather than creating their own?
that's a good question, Becky. And I remember going all the way back to my very first time I've ever worked with schools, that this always does come up. I'll never forget when folks would say, can't we just use the standards and the targets that you guys picked in your district? Is inevitably the question that always came up. I remember thinking, well, why can't they? And it's a great, genuine question. And I think one of the biggest reasons that folks ask that is it is a lot of work to take the standards to solely break them down. And I think a lot of times we have this idea initially when we talk about, we're going to take a look at our standards. And I know we use the visual of like a straight, clear road, a straight, clear highway, right? But in reality, as we begin to dig into this work, it is far much more of that winding, rocky, uphill path that is not a clear path at all. And as soon as we make that transition in our brains from that clear path to the winding rocky, we say, whoa, there's got to be a better way to do this. And we always hear, as you said, can't we work smarter, not harder? Someone else did this. Isn't there a shortcut, right? And so just starting with the fact that to me, it is hard work. And as much as it sometimes I get frustrated a little bit, I can say not everyone actually enjoys looking at standards. Not everyone enjoys digging into standards. So, and there are some folks that say, if I have to look at standards again, I don't know. And there's some educators, rightfully so, that have done this now 3 to 5 times in their career, because we know that at a minimum right now, most state standards or national standards are getting edited at least once every 10 years. So for some places, they feel like they just did this and they're not wrong. So as they're trying to work through it, but it really is, it's really hard work. And also, I'll just kind of add, the other thing we hear from folks is they'll say, I'm not a curriculum writer. And over and over from folks is that they wonder, like they feel like I'm not trained to be a curriculum writer. And so that's one of those big points that I think that we try to help guide folks through is we say, you're not writing curriculum at this moment. Or I say, when you take a look at, when you take a look at your curriculum, if you're looking at your textbooks, most of that curriculum was not written for you, right? It's written for other states potentially when you dig into where your textbook comes from. So this is really all about how do we get you to dig into your standards, dig into your curriculum to have a true deep understanding of it. But just deep down inside, like, it's a lot of work and not everyone enjoys it. And we expect it to be this quick thing that'll take 5 minutes. And then when we're in hour 2 of it, we're like, oh goodness, how long is this going to take? So that's my quick early thoughts for you on that.
First of all, Don, I'm appalled that you think not everybody enjoys doing that work because they're not like us. Is that what you're saying? No, I'm just kidding. But I've heard those exact same things as well. And I really love the analogy that you utilized of being able to go, like, not having a straight pathway of, this road that's perfectly paved, straight and narrow. We can see the start to finish. But I also love how you then stated it is more of like a winding pathway, like we're climbing up a mountain and we may not be able to see around each of those turns along the way. And I think that's a great analogy because, when we say a lot of times, like, it's not always fun work to do, but it's the right work to do. So I really loved how you also, brought into the idea of the curriculum writing and that, when we adopt and get these different curriculum pieces, that this is not always, it's not written specifically for us. We need to make it for us and the students in our classrooms. Garth, what do you think contributes to teachers feeling this way?
Well, I think first of all, I want to add one piece to the analogy, if it's possible, around the winding roads and everything. And I also potholes. I just think about living in Wisconsin and the number of potholes we have in our roads, and sometimes it's not only the winding roads and the bumpiness, but it's actually like you feel your vehicle actually jump when you hit these potholes. So maybe other people in their states are feeling that same way too. But I think I want to go back, Becky, to several years ago. So when I first came into the district we had worked in together, and we knew that one of our first steps to clarity was having to go back and revisit our standards because either, as Don mentioned, it had not been done in a while, and for a lot of our teachers, they actually had never done it before. They never really had dug in and broken down standards and written learning targets, etc. And I remember that it wasn't a lot of the time that it was super resistance. I think it was sometimes lack of confidence as well. And most teachers want to make sure that they're doing things the right way. They want to feel confident that what they're producing is going to be good for kids. And I know, Don, I know you've shared this, Becky, I know you've experienced this well. I've experienced this even just going and working with other districts, is they're really worried that they're going to potentially mess up instruction because they did it the wrong way. They broke it down the wrong way. They didn't have the right learning targets. And so I think sometimes the resistance also comes out of just the sheer place of heart that they want to do the right work and they're afraid of messing it up. But one thing I want to go back to that scenario where when we did this in our district, I didn't have much of a roadmap to work from. I was a new curriculum director. I knew we needed to do that work, and we took and we broke down. And Becky, I don't know if you remember this or not. We broke down every single standard, that was out there. Like, we're breaking them all down. We didn't prioritize. We didn't do anything. We just said we're going to break all of them down. And I do remember teachers, pushing back a little bit because that took us a lot of time to be able to do it. And in retrospect, I wish I had a better process. But the one thing I want to speak to, and I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, the end result of the teachers doing that work and not having it handed to them was they fully knew where they were going with our students. They knew it. And too often, and this will get into some of the challenges here in a little bit, too often we get into once we hand them, so let's flip it to the other, like, okay, great, let's not reinvent the wheel, let's use someone else's. Then we give it to them, they say, well, that's not right either. Like, why did you pick this? Why did you break it down that way? And so they're not happy with the outcome anyway from it. And so I just think that, one, some of the resistance comes out of just lack of confidence. And then the other piece, and all of you have alluded to this and will continue to, is the time issue. There is a legit concern. Becky and I were just out in Montana working with phenomenal 14 different schools out there last week, at the end of last week. And I explicitly remember hearing a lot of the conversation. This all makes sense. But I'm one teacher. I have 5 different preps. When am I going to do this for every single one of my classes? And so time is a legit reason as well. And so whether, if you're a curriculum leader, a principal, in some type of a instructional leadership role, that's something that we have to be aware of as well, is because I think once people understand the process, there's a sense of overwhelmingness to it, because they think about, how do I actually get this done for all of my classes, all of the standards that I have prioritized within those classes. And so then I think it's that feeling of like, oh my gosh, this seems like a really, really heavy lift. But yet every single time, once they get on the other side of it, they also say that's probably one of the best things we could have done.
Yeah, and I thank you for sharing that, because I think that's a huge piece. Most of the time that resistance doesn't come from a place, as you were saying, of it's not that I don't want to do the work, I just don't know how to do the work or the time that goes with it. And I think the other side of that also, I think, is okay, well, you purchase a resource to be able to support your teaching and learning in your classroom, and you think about the amount of time that it takes to siphon through. Like, I've so many schools I've worked with in the past couple of months are like, well, we're up for resource adoption next year, and we're going to do this. A lot of the schools we work with, they're like reading adoption curriculum. They're like, okay, well, next year we have to spend so much time to be able to understand the resource and be able to use it and put it into practice. But would you guys both agree that in reality, if you had done the work or had a place to be able to do the work to prioritize those standards and make those make sense, that would actually probably lighten the load for when you do have those adoptions? Because now when you create or decide what resources you want to adopt, you have almost a roadmap to go from, which are those standards that you had prioritized and the learning targets that you developed to help those make sense. Would you guys both agree with that as well?
Yeah, and I love how you just said that, Becky. You give yourself a roadmap as you're looking at the resources, and I think too often, as some folks are looking at those resources, if they haven't done the work with the standards, it's almost like they're doing it blindly. Of like, they're looking at the resources, thinking about the gaps of the previous resource, and how this new one fills a gap of a previous resource, not how does this resource help us meet the needs of our students with instruction. And so it's not when you're looking at the resource, it should be, how does this look at compared to the standards? Where are the gaps? What are the needs of our students? Not what were the gaps of the previous resource that we use. So I love how you said it gives you a roadmap and makes it a lot easier.
So, kind of thinking through both of your experiences, both of you have also held leadership roles in schools that have kind of gone through and done this work. And we talked about maybe some of the challenges or the reasons that maybe we hear this common concern about, can't we just take somebody else's? Why reinvent the wheel? What role do you guys think leadership plays in helping to kind of either diminish or help preventing this type of overwhelming feeling? And Garth, you alluded to that a little bit from the time constraint, and making sure that we allow time for that to be able to occur from a leadership standpoint. But is there anything else that you guys think are like that role that leaders need to take to be able to help with this that you could maybe talk about or reflect on a little bit?
I can dive in on this, Don, if you want. I think whether it's this work or anything that schools are attempting to tackle in terms of initiatives or focal points that they're working on within the school, I think the number one role of the leader is to remove barriers, remove the barriers from being able to do the work. So, for example, I brought up already the idea of time. Well, if we know that that's going to be one of the number one things that teachers are going to use as part of the reason why this fire comes up in the first place, right? Let's be honest, they go straight to it because they're thinking about that challenge of time. You have to be ready to explain how you're going to make sure they have time to do the work. And I get, depending on which state you're in and the amount of time that's dedicated, that can be a little bit of a challenge. So then you have to, as a leader, start to think about, in what ways can I make time available for our staff to be able to do that? Some districts, during the summer, they have kind of dedicated curriculum writing time. Great. That's one way to be able to do that. But a lot of states, they don't have, a lot of districts, they don't have that as a resource. Sometimes you have to look within the school year to say, okay, how can I free up time for the teachers to be able to work on this? And I think one of the number one things that helped for some of our teachers that had multiple preps that were trying to go through this work is not only freeing up the time, but supporting them during that time. So, for example, And I know, Don, I've heard you talk about this recently in a district you were in where it was a subject area that was definitely not your expertise, but understanding process and sitting along with them just to be able to troubleshoot some of the ideas they have is all most teachers are looking for, right? They again, because it goes back to what I brought up about the confidence. They need someone to be able to at least say, yeah, this seems like you're on the right track. You've got the process that you're using. So going back to this idea of leaders removing barriers, you got to identify what are the barriers that lead to this fire and how do you begin to remove them to be able to make it successful. And I would also say, that process of letting the teachers come in, us working side by side through it, um, not only it was just as powerful for me because it built my confidence more in what was being taught in each of our classes and how to support that as much as it did the teachers. So I think that's one big leadership tip is identify the barriers right away, or the challenges that we can anticipate and be ready for them. Don't feel like, okay, teachers are coming with this and I don't have a plan. Don, what else do you think on that?
Can I just had a follow-up question quick, Don? Are you okay if I just jump in with that? Since with so if I'm hearing you correctly, Garth, you're really saying like the administrators that are helping lead this work should dive in and try the work out themselves as well. Is that what you're kind of leading to, is to saying, okay, so feel what that feels like, go through those motions, so you're able to coach them in those times when they do come up with those questions?
Yes, absolutely. And I know some administrators that will actually go through and go through the entire process on their own just to feel really confident in it. But I think the bigger piece is working alongside the best that you can. I know everyone also has, time, as administrators, we have time restrictions as well. But to be able to sit with the teachers, participate in the discussions, it really helps lead to a better end product and confidence in the process. We don't need to, leaders, you don't need to be experts in all of the content, but, and I've heard Don say this multiple times, you need to be experts in the process. And that's the biggest thing that will help your teachers kind of work through some of those, is just participating in the actual work with them.
Thank you. All right, Don, go ahead.
Adding what Garth just said, there's far too many content areas for an administrator to try to know them all, right? But as Garth said, you have to be a master in the process, and that means practicing in an area you're comfortable with. It also means practicing in an area you're not comfortable with, because you have to be able to be flexible and understand how the process that your district has picked works with each of the content areas. Because one of the things I remember Becky and I had a discussion a long time ago, and this is a different topic from the day of, it's this idea of a square peg in a round hole, and we say now actually they're all like their own shapes and their own shaped holes, right? It's that moment of how do we help people see it's about the process we're going through. It's not about one specific content area. So how do we help support them? But the other big area, and I know we'll talk about this in just a little bit, but administrators have to do a really great job, leaders, of truly helping people understand the why of the work. Why are we doing this? What are the examples? What are the pitfalls if we don't do this work? And what does that look like? And how do we lay that out? I know we're going to talk about some of that coming up, but if we don't do a great foundation of here's why. So like for a teacher who doesn't enjoy digging into standards, they need to know, why am I about to spend 6 hours doing this? And they need to feel good about that. And they need to say, okay, I understand I'm doing this because it leads to this. And if we don't do this, here are the things that are going to occur. And a lot of times I know we both, or all of us, walk into these situations where people don't have that solid why, and they feel like I'm just creating another binder of prioritized standards like I did 10 years ago. And we try to help them break that down and say, no, it's so much more than that. Now we've learned a lot. It's not about putting it into back in the days, an old platform that you would load all your standards in and then nobody would look at it again, or it sits on a shelf on a binder and nobody looks at it ever again. And that, because that's the actual experience they're coming with, which is also why they don't potentially want to do it, because they remember we spent hours. And I remember one teacher saying to me, I got paid about 80 hours one summer. It was great money, and then it just sat on a shelf. We didn't ever do anything with it. I'm like, yes, and they're right. I mean, I can't blame them that they say we don't want to potentially do this again. So that's one of those when we say we have to do a really good job of helping explain. Here's the why we do that. So.
Becky, can I just add a little bit to that too? Just I think kind of putting that into perspective of kind of the two ideas that Don and I just shared, and Becky and I do this a lot when we run workshops. especially like around changes, using kind of the need it, see it, start it, show it kind of framework for how you tackle an initiative or tackle a focal point. To Don's point, I think the number one thing as leaders is show the need for why they're doing that work. That's that why, you know, foundationally make sure to how it connects back to really what the goals are in each and every one of our classrooms. But they also do need to see it. They need to see successful examples of what it looks like. So they can begin to put their own mind around what would this look like in my context. I can see now what an end product can look like as a part of that. But then you got to get them started with it in terms of, okay, now that you know the need, you've seen what it looks like, just start with one and begin to work from there. That's where that confidence level is going to build. And this is something that I have found over the years. I don't think I did enough of this as a leader, but I think it's really powerful to kind of make sure that the teachers know there is going to be a little bit of opportunity for feedback, reinforcement that they're doing the work, is to show it, whether that's to show it to you, as a leader, but also to be able to show their colleagues the work that they're doing. It's a very powerful learning opportunity for them, and to be able to see others, not just about the idea of you showing what you're doing. It might spark a new thought or idea for that person on the receiving end of seeing that might help them in their work as well. So I think a key takeaway: need it, see it, start it, show it.
Yes, thank you both. And Don, I didn't know if you noticed as you were kind of talking about the curriculum binder on the wall and maybe some platforms that maybe give some teachers a little apprehension. I was laughing to myself because I remember that exact feeling of one platform that we used in particular in our district. And I remember we would have to go and we would sit in the computer lab and work together in a space. And we were all just like, how are we going to use this? Or where does this land? Or what does this work lead to? So I love that you guys both really brought up, the importance of understanding that why, but also understanding what are the pitfalls if we don't do this work. So here's the benefits of doing this work, but what are also the pitfalls of us not doing that? And I think those are two really, really important points, whether that's from a leadership standpoint or whoever it is that may be leading this work in a district or with a school, but if we don't see that connection to, so often we want to lead with the end in mind, which we need to have an end in mind. But a lot of times that end in mind is, what does my report card look like? And I was just talking with the school this morning about report cards and some planning, and that, the question from the teachers very often is, what does my report card look like? Well, it's really hard for us to have those conversations if we don't know what we're assessing kids on. And if we can't decide what we're assessing kids on if we don't have clarity in the standards that we're prioritizing and making those make sense by developing those targets and those success indicators. So I think that brings back that big picture. But I think there's also a component of that when we talk about those benefits and then those pitfalls of us not doing that is, how do we use these with kids? And I know that's a conversation again for another time, but it's an important piece of that puzzle of truly understanding, like, this work is not just for us, although it may feel that way. We sit down and we go through the prioritization and we make those standards make sense, but that's not just for us. So we need to, I think, also, when we talk about the benefits of doing this, we need to look at it, the benefits through the kids. And we also need to look at it as the benefits through us as educators in our district as a whole. So just kind of closing in on that point there too, but seeing values of that. And I think one of the things that's been helpful to me to kind of reiterate and kind of going back to that confidence piece is, these decisions aren't also set in stone. And while we're making these decisions, sometimes it's not always that means because we chose these 7 priorities, that as we start going through that clarity journey, we might have to retweak some of those things. So it's not, and I think sometimes that's also helpful for people to hear who are kind of diving in and going through this work is, your decisions today, things may tweak and change, and that's okay. And just that validation sometimes is, I know for me at least, has been helpful when working with some schools. But kind of speaking of those schools and kind of wanting to lean a little bit deeper into maybe some of the experiences that you guys have had out doing this work, do you guys have any maybe specific examples of schools who maybe have attempted to just use somebody else's priority standards or learning targets, and maybe a little bit of insight as if they did, how did that play out? What types of things did they start to notice? Have any of you had any of those experiences in working with schools or even in your own districts when you were in those districts doing this work?
Can I jump in first, Garth? I think the number one example we see right now is the number of schools that say, well, our report card, we decided to do this work. We just copied the report card from the district down the road who we knew was having success. And maybe we need to redo that because we don't actually know what this is. And every time we have to get to our report card time, the teachers don't know what they're reporting against, and it's very confusing, and they don't really have a clear understanding of what they're actually reporting out. Because but at the same time, it was working for that district, so we thought it would work for us as well. That's like the quick number one thing. Like the best example we hear over and over is we just took that district's report card, and that's what we're reporting out on. Garth, what are you also hearing?
Well, it reminds me of a lot of times Becky or Don and I will go into school districts and do kind of an analysis, kind of whether you want to call it a clarity analysis, a stagger analysis. Like sometimes they'll call it like a standards-based grading analysis. And one of the first questions we ask when we get in and start talking with teachers is, how do you determine what you teach? And more common than not, the response is, we're just given a document. We're given our standards, we're given our scope and sequence, we're given kind of that blueprint and say, okay, well, were you part of any of that discussion? No. So then we always follow, like, do you know why this was picked? And typically the answer is no. And so then it's no wonder why sometimes we don't have the clarity in our classrooms. It's because we're given a blueprint that we haven't been a part. It's like it's like somebody building a customized home, like you're having a builder build a customized home for you, but you never actually had to say in anything that went in. That's no longer customized, right? That's a whole different scenario. And so I think it's that that idea we hear a lot of. They're really not sure, but it's very common that we'll come into that, and then you can tell in the teachers' voices that they're not confident in, to Don's point, let's just say, take it even to the report card level. They're not actually confident in what they're communicating to students and to their caregivers because they didn't know what success looked like in the first place. They didn't know and I think that's a big piece of this, Becky, is it's one thing to just say, hey, here are your standards. Every state has standards. And maybe even sometimes if they say those are, the teachers don't have a say in even what's been identified as their selected priority standards. Let's just take it even to that step. The teachers still need to have an active say in what does success look like in their students to say that they're getting to that point of where we want them to be. And also, what does it look like in our teaching practices? And if we don't at least have those conversations, then we truly are teaching blindfolded in our classrooms. And I think that's a big piece that we commonly will come up against because the teachers will often feel like they don't even have that say. So that's where sometimes then we start talking with the administrators. They'll say, well, absolutely. We've had that dialogue, but in their minds, they haven't. And so I think it's just kind of looking at and doing a little bit of a reset is important. And the other thing I just want to add to that is too often we get involved, us at the Stagger Center here, we get involved after that conversation is long past, right? Where they're asking us to come in, we may be coming in and talking with them around effective grading practices. When in reality, as we kind of peel back the onion per se, we realize we really do, a lot of these schools need to start a little bit more from scratch within the process.
And I'll just continue to add on that in the districts where they'd skipped it, right, and they decided to take someone else's, and we'll talk about the why still in just a little bit, but in reality, it's all about there's a lot of ambiguity there, and I like to use that word because it comes from our friend Jenny Donahue talking about the enemies of efficacy. And one of the big enemies of efficacy within schools and teachers is ambiguity. It's uncertainty. It's the unknown. It's a lack of clarity. And when someone else does the work, we lose the ownership and the meaning behind that work and the true deep understanding of what all that means. So in those districts, inevitably, what always ends up happening is someone eventually says, what does this mean? And I don't understand. And they say, who actually created this, right? That's the thing we end up hearing. And sometimes we say, well, like, that is a great question. Who did create that? Because if it's not you, that's an important discussion. And now, just so you know, like, as we think through this, like, that there's so much turnover in schools, even the districts where they did it within house, that occurs. So when you have new teachers coming in, that occurs on a yearly basis. What does this mean? And even if We created it ourselves a year later. And I always say to folks, just because you prioritize a standard and wrote a learning target in one spring does not mean it's going to make sense the next spring to you. So it's like, that's the one thing to remember. Even when we do the work, sometimes we still have questions, much less if we're taking someone else's. So how do we're always on this quest, in my opinion, to reduce the ambiguity and to create clarity, right? Really for us and for our students and for our parents. And if we're just taking someone else's, we're putting in a huge, I think, roadblock there, a stop sign eventually where we're going to say, what does this actually mean? Because it's completely open to interpretation. And we'll talk about that in just another minute too. So
Well, Don, I want to follow up with you, and then Garth, I have a follow-up question for you as well. But Don, I'm thinking back to it, and I know these slides that you use, and I'm thinking of the slides you use of the standards of just even kind of understanding where you're talking. You were just mentioning this, that great importance of that clarity, and maybe you know what I'm talking about. So Don, a lot of times will share, and I'll let him dive in a little bit of a sixth grade, a seventh grade, and an eighth grade. I think it's a writing standard is the particular example that you utilize. And I'm going to let you kind of take over from here. I just wanted to kind of tee you up for that. But you kind of talk about that. So I think that's so important where we're like, well, our standards are our standards. But I think there's also a value of, we sometimes get pigeonholed into looking into our classroom only. And we're like, well, that's clear. That's perfectly fine. But can you talk a little bit about what does that look like from a lens of vertical alignment and also why that is so incredibly important? Another reason I should say of importance for us to be able to do this work on our own because we have to also take into account the grade levels above and below us.
yeah, as we started, and I don't mean any disrespect to those that wrote the standards when I say these things, that people have spent a lot of great time, I think, really helping narrow down what are those things we really want our students to know and learn as we work through it. And so the folks that have really invested the time in the standards, I think, have done an incredible job. But then as we continue to, I should say, and we always say not all standards are created equally. I think as we continue to look at standards, they continue to get better from state to state and nationally. And they are all kind of written in a little different form, but sometimes we assume just because a team came together and wrote those that there's a lot of clarity and a lot of understanding about what they are, and they're really well written. And the examples Becky's kind of referring to, and you can find these in nearly every single content area, is in one in ELA standards in sixth grade. The difference between a sixth grade standard all the way to eighth grade, there's a lot of words on the screen for the standard. I think there's about maybe 50 or 60 words. The only difference between the 50 and 60 words between sixth grade to eighth grade is the word some to many. As we think through what does the difference between some and many mean to any of us, and if we're saying if in sixth grade they have to do something, by the time we get to eighth grade it's many. Well, what does seventh grade do? Seventh grade is actually written identical to sixth grade. So what's the difference between sixth grade and seventh grade? And as Becky said, it was great. Like if we are in silos, what does that look like in sixth grade to seventh grade? Are we communicating truly what that looks like to each of us, much less than to eighth grade when we flip to just now, we will move from some to many. The other example I use is one of the standards talks about citing textual evidence. And in sixth grade, it's you have to support, right? By the time you get to eighth grade, you have to strongly support. That's all the wording that's there. And I don't know about you guys, but my definition of strongly might be very different than all of yours. And so we assume that the standards are written well. So people did great work, but there's a lot of ambiguity there, if you ask me, and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of stuff for us to dig into. And I even remember I was supporting a culinary arts teacher when we were looking at their standards. The standards are written in a way that says, we are not going to create your courses. You have to now select which standards align to what course. And it's up to you as a district to figure out what is the scope and sequence of these standards and how you cover them as you work through your high school path. And so it's like, well, we even think, even to that point, like we have to dig in our own, like the state's telling us we have to do that. So I think there's just a lot of ambiguity there. And it's about slowing down and really working through that process. So we all know, here's what supports means to me, and here's what strongly supports means to me versus each of you guys as we work through that.
Yeah, and I think, thank you for sharing that. That just always stuck out to me as such a even a compelling reason about why we need to do this work. Simply looking, like I'm thinking for anybody who's leading this work of even just taking a set of standards and look at what that looks like, that same or similar standard through the grade levels, and even just using that as the conversational point, which is I know kind of your purpose of using them and starting that conversation of, well, what does that mean? And another thing I think, can be incredibly valuable too is even just have teachers who teach the same grade level or the same exact course, everyone look at a standard and just on your own write out what you think that means and have yourselves converse at a table, because more than likely it's probably not the same, or there are some things that are maybe up for debate or can cause confusion, or terms that can mean multiple different things, and we have to really get to the identity of what that is. And I know, so often we'll get the question, right? And Garth, I'm going to see if you have anything to chime in here on, we get the question of, then why are the standards written that way? And unfortunately, we don't necessarily have control over that. But what if, Garth, like, do you have any like talking points potentially around that? Because I do feel like maybe we wonder that ourselves, right? Or maybe if we are, thinking of kind of helping some of the leaders who are following along with us here too, of like, how do you navigate that question or the answer to that question?
I don't know if there's a great answer to that question. I think there's the better way to maybe approach it is to have a shared understanding of that. So when they say why are the standards written that way, as Don mentioned, there's a lot of really, really smart people out there that come together and say, here's what we think kids need to know by the time they go through their K-12 schooling in ELA or math or science or social studies, or as Don mentioned, culinary arts, whatever it may be. And each one of those people on those groups, they bring a perspective to it, right, in terms of what it is. But I think in doing that, sometimes there leads to some feelings of we're not even really sure, if this is understandable. One of the questions that Becky, Don, and I will always use in front of a group when we're starting with this dialogue, just around standards in the first place, is we say, how many of you feel that the way that your standards are written are really confusing for students? And everybody will put their hands up in the room, and then we follow up and be like, how many of you feel that it's really confusing for us as highly trained adults that are experts in your area? And the number of head nods and that type of stuff. So I don't think we can ever really fully answer as to why they're written that way. Each state has their own kind of process that they use. And I mean, they reach out to people. And I know a lot of states that have, teachers that are a part of those teams. But I think in what ends up happening is they try to kind of write this set perfect language of what should go in there. And I don't know if there's always that further discussion of, so what does this actually look like successfully in the classroom? But I think that's also then kind of going to a point I made a little bit earlier. That's, I would say, the opportunity for us as educators is we get to define it. Don, using that example of those kind of two different words in those standards in that particular state. Well, the benefit is, yeah, the standards might look the same. The language might be exactly the same, with the exception of one descriptor being a little bit different from sixth grade to seventh grade to eighth grade. But we get to define those differences then. And I'd say that's the most powerful part of this entire conversation. And, I think if I could go back, to my first year of teaching in the classroom, I never really knew. I didn't have any standards in my classroom. There weren't any standards that were written at the time. So I was creating a new course, and the principal said, "Here's a book from like 1972. Can you take and develop a speech class from?" Yeah, and the benefit of that was I did get to kind of decide, what is it that the kids want to walk away with. But the one thing that I still didn't know is to truly have an understanding of what success looks like. And I think this is the missing piece and so critical to the conversation as far as why we're having it. Even like, I know, like in the past when I did PLC work, like we identified our standards and we went to building assessments without actually having the dialogue to say, okay, first and foremost, when we break this down, using Don that example in sixth grade ELA, do we know what it actually looks like for a kid to be successful on this particular standard? And more importantly, then we have to take that conversation deeper to not just what that is. The other missing piece of this dialogue is that shared conversation with our colleagues on, do we really know what it looks like to successfully teach this particular standard or the targets that have come from it? That's the power in this entire dialogue. That's where the clarity comes from. And so, we use the phrase when we're working with teachers, success indicators. And I think that alone, Becky, kind of going back to the original question is, yeah, we don't really have, we don't know what sometimes leads to the development or the decision for what goes into these standards. But on the flip side, here's where now you get to be empowered. Don mentioned, collective teacher advocacy. We know that is the number one thing that has the influence on student learning. Well, one of those factors, one of those conditions that frequently will also lead to that is that empowerment. Well, great. Now we're going to empower you to be able to have that dialogue around what success looks like. And when they have that dialogue, Becky, they know what they're aiming for. It's hard to hit a target if you can't see what you're aiming for. And so this allows us to be able to see that. And I think then that kind of helps offset some of those conversations on why were these written in the first place the way they are, because we get to have that ownership in saying, here's what it actually looks like in our classrooms.
So for fun, can we do this? Let's do the quick activity that sometimes we do with teachers, with each of us. Do you guys have a piece of paper in front of you? Find one quick. Becky, do you also have one?
I got one.
Hopefully you can follow along at home. Okay, those who are watching us live, grab your piece of paper. First thing you're going to do is you're going to fold your piece of paper in half. Okay, I'm going to give what I think are some pretty clear directions right now. Okay, fold your piece of paper in half.
Done.
Now we're going to fold it in half again. Okay, and then we'll fold it one more time in half. And then from here, I want you to tear the bottom right-hand corner of your piece of paper off. Like tear that corner off. Sometimes here's why we don't do one more fold. It's like it's kind of hard.
I'm struggling already.
So then as we do that, as we all lift up then to show our pieces of paper, how close are we on our designs? So they were pretty clear. Fold. Becky and I are there. Somehow we magically got there.
We did. Do you know I had
I'm the one that can't follow directions, apparently.
I couldn't rip it because it was too thick, so I had to go with a different corner.
Okay.
So you didn't go with the right the lower right?
No, because I couldn't rip it. It was the center.
Don, how many directions was that?
Was it 1, 2, 3, 4? I think 4. So
can you see even how people? Can you hold yours back up again? I want to see yours.
Yeah.
Okay, so but we even had different folds. That's what I was curious. Like you could have folded multiple ways. So
yes,
mine looks like Cooper, my dog, just ate this. So
that's what I was thinking. A dog bite off the edge.
What I love about that activity, if you get a chance to just do it with staff, is Garth's point out, it's 4 clear or 4 quick directions. We thought were crystal clear, but every step along the way, there was a chance for each of us to make a different decision and pivot and go a different way. So there was ambiguity, even though we thought it was crystal clear. Just like we think the standards are crystal clear, there's an opportunity there where we make our own decisions and we go in a slightly different direction. And when you go slightly, every little move you do can really create a very different, and just visually, as you saw, Becky and I happened to get there because she ended up picking a different bottom right-hand corner, but that's just sometimes a quick visual for folks to see. This is how we think we're being crystal clear and we have clarity, but we really actually sometimes don't. So
yeah, thank you. And I love that was actually done virtually because we couldn't look at the person next to us like, hey, how are you folding yours? But so I think that really does mimic the exact conversations, that we have within that process. So one of the things that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about before we're finished this morning is like, what advice would you give somebody who has so often, right? Rarely do we have teachers who are teaching one prep. So, or even if they're elementary, there are multiple subjects that are being taught within that classroom. We get to middle school and high school. Typically, a lot of times we have multiple preps that we're teaching. So kind of going back to a little bit, kind of that overwhelming feeling, that time feeling, but what advice would you give, right, to teachers and to leaders who are leading this work when we're kind of pressed with that question? Like, what do I do if I have multiple preps? Where do I start? How do I get going? How do I manage all of this?
Well, I'll jump in, and I know commonly we'll share, and this is again just our perspective on it is start with one class, and work through and feel comfortable with the fact that you're just focused on that one, and don't worry about the other ones yet until you at least get to experience the process, go through it. I know sometimes a lot of our teachers that teach multiple preps, they want to I just want to take this on all at the same time. That's what leads to then that feeling of frustration or feeling a little bit overwhelmed. So in my personal experiences working with teachers on this is get them through the process once. And we'll get this question a lot from schools when we're working with them is, from whether it's the curriculum director or superintendents or principals, like, do we get through writing targets in ELA and then, for our elementary folks, focus on math? And typically we'd say, no, keep going through, learn this process along the way, be confident with just focusing on one subject area. Or if you're a secondary teacher and you have the multiple classes, just one class, because then you can also, I think what's been helpful is they see what went into that, like through the end game, and then they can begin to wrap their minds around, now how do I position time, energy, resources as I go through and do it again in another class. So Don, I don't know if you have a different opinion on that, but I know personally that's what I've seen help with teachers to just be able to only focus on the ones that don't have that overwhelming feeling about the other ones out there.
No, you're spot on. And I think when you work through the process with one, you gain confidence, clarity, and a sense of efficacy around the process. You said administrators, remember, don't have to be masters of the content; they're masters of the process. That's similar to for teachers. When you're teaching different courses, they are different, right? But it's about you really getting confident in the process, and then you see the end product, and you're like, "Oh, I can see what they meant by this. I can see the direction we're trying to go," and it dramatically accelerates the process the second time you do it.
So as we kind of talk about that process, right? And if we have, very commonly we have multiple preps, like we said, or multiple content areas that we're responsible for. So when we think about, like, I think that brings up the question of, like, who does this work? So what would be, your recommendations between the two of you of who should have a seat at the table, right? When these conversations are happening in reference to prioritizing the standards, making those standards make sense by developing those learning targets and those success indicators. What would be the ideal scenario or situation for that work?
Ideally, everyone who's involved with the students in that course or that grade level, who interacts with them, interacts with the class. Ideally, that's the perfect dream scenario. Now, that being said, that's not always possible. We work with districts that are very large, and we always give the example of, if you were to bring 40 elementary schools together from a district and ask all the teachers in that grade level to come together, that's hundreds of adults. So we know that isn't always possible, which in itself brings up other issues of, now once again, we're back to some ambiguity of who wrote these, who picked these. In a perfect world, we have the ability to bring everyone together, because then everyone's part of the process and has true buy-in to, here's how we get, or at least a true understanding of, here's how we got to this result. And so then I always say, and if you are one of those districts where you're exceptionally large and to bring everyone together is nearly impossible, then you still have to at some point slow down and go through the entire process, like a micro version of it with everyone. So everyone understands, here's the final product we're about to give you, but let's tell you the story of how we got here. And once again, have them become masters of the process to understand how we got there. Because then from there, they can always reverse engineer. This is how we got here. They have a much better understanding of, here's where we are. But I suggest, highly recommend, if we can, everybody who's involved with the students. And sometimes we'll hear, Garth, I don't know about you, but I'll hear some folks say, like a special ed teacher say, well, I didn't go to school in this content area. But especially as we're digging into those standards, though, they bring such an incredible lens of, from the student perspective, that if they're sitting in that meeting and we are really breaking that standard down and creating clarity around it and success indicators, if the other adults in the room who aren't the quote content experts don't understand what's going in there, well, then if they don't understand it, well, of course, many of the students won't either. So they bring in a really valuable perspective from many different lenses. But that's just kind of where I'll jump in and say that.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, every single one of those people, even though they may not have the background in the content, they're all experts in kids, right? They're all experts in learning, whether they're early in the stages of the career or beyond that. I would also say for like the really large districts, another way that I've seen it done, again, getting a little bit creative with it, is having, the buildings, each of the buildings go through the process, identify what it looks like, and then having a representative from that building come to kind of one meeting together where every building brings their ideas to it. They come together and try to seek some commonality. So then again, to your point, Don, I do think it's going beyond just we're going to have a representative from our building there. We're going through and we're at least saying, hey, we had a voice collectively as a building or as a grade level team as a part of this bigger picture. To Don's point, as many people that can have their eyes on the standards, on the process, give voice to the process. That's only going to help them feel better about the end result, which is when it comes back to them to say, here we go, here's what it looks like in a fourth grade ELA class or a 10th grade American Lit class, whatever it may be. At least they feel like they had the opportunity to provide something as a part of that ongoing process.
Yeah, and I love those perspectives. Those are very common questions. Like what if our, if possible, right? Recommendation of everyone having a seat at the table so we can really dig deep and we can really have an understanding. Realizing that that's not always feasible. I know there's a district out in California that I've worked with for some time, and they have multiple elementary schools. So to be able to bring all of their first grade teachers or all of their second grade teachers, so they have representation from each building, one person from each building in each grade level, so that they can create those together. But then, as you mentioned, Don, there's a large amount of time that is dedicated then to the conversations around that as they bring that back to their schools. And then they bring it back to the team. Okay, here's some notices and wonders that we had. How do we want to change or tweak or update that as well? So I think those are great pieces. One of the things that I want to circle back onto here, and I know we just have a few minutes left, but it's still going back to the conversation around time. Like, how long does this take? Do we have a professional development model that's being able to be put in place that's effective to be able to allocate, the teacher? How do we remove those barriers, Garth, as you had mentioned earlier? What are your thoughts about, we have AI available to us now. What are your thoughts, if both of you could maybe just speak on that before we end today, about using AI to be able to help or support in this process, and maybe some benefits and some things to maybe look out for if you choose to go that pathway in doing or supporting some of this work with prioritizing those standards, developing those targets and those success indicators?
I know, Garth, you've had good success with some folks with using it with kind of a process and a criteria. I'll let you talk about that in a second. I'll just talk about why I think I like how Garth does it. Is because AI has the potential to be no different than just taking someone else's standards, right? Because you plug them in and it spits it out. And so that's my caution as folks think about it, is that AI is no different than taking the standards from the district down the street. Okay. If we don't slow down and unpack it. So Garth, do you mind just kind of talking through how you did that with folks?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that's really important, first and foremost, the emergence of generative AI can most definitely help in this process with us, right? Because sometimes I think about in the past, we get to the point where we're trying to identify success indicators for a learning target, and the teachers are sitting around the table and like, they can think of maybe one or two things. And so it can help spark conversation. Our good friend Myron Dueck, a couple years ago, I remember him using the phrase thought partner, using it as a thought partner in the work. And so one thing I noticed, though, as schools were starting to use generative AI in the process, was there really wasn't process, as Don mentioned. It kind of became the same thing. We're gonna plug it into whatever platform we want to use. It's going to spit out some information. We're going to take it. We're going to plug it into whatever document we're filling out. There we go. Done. Move on. And look, we were able to do an entire course in a matter of 45 minutes. Well, what ends up happening is very similar then when it got to the point with some of the schools, as we've had conversations once we get involved after the fact with them, and say, well, we're not really sure why we have that in there. So then it's kind of that same thing of there's relative kind of disagreement to what's in there, or like, well, it's in there, but I know what it's like to teach us. That's not accurate. So you do have to have just like you have to have a process for breaking standards down and writing learning targets, you have to have a process and protocol for how you use AI within the framework of the discussion. The most powerful piece that I've witnessed with the use of generative AI is the dialogue that comes after the fact of when it's given you some points to consider. So whether that's talking about, I actually think where I find it most fascinating is when using AI around success indicators for the teachers, like how we're going about teaching these targets. And I was with a group not too long ago in Utah, and we were using it as a part of the conversation. They were using the protocol. And I remember a teacher saying very explicitly, she goes, I never would have thought of that as a strategy to be able to help with it. Well, the benefit was I had a virtual follow-up with them about 2 weeks later. I said, hey, did you try that strategy? She's like, yes, and it worked. It was fantastic. But if they didn't have that as a part of the dialogue, she never would have gotten to that outcome or that impact that she saw from it. So definitely have a framework of questions to use when it's generating information to drive the conversation. But we can't just take it, just like anything else you would hear if it's students using AI to help write a paper, whatever. You can't just take it and use exactly what it is. Use it as a way to promote ideas as a part of a bigger discussion. And so having kind of a protocol for how they engage in that conversation is really important.
Yeah, I think those are some really great points too. And I use Myron's phrase often too as using it as a thought partner. And just to kind of add on to that before we close today, I've also found value in using it almost as like a reverse engineering. So where we sit down and we, figure out make that standard make sense. We develop those learning targets after we've prioritized those, develop those success indicators, and then putting that work we've done into a generative AI to say, here was the standard we started with. This is what we came up with. Can you help me show where there is alignment? Does anything look misaligned? Does there need an additional clarity? Just to continue to fuel that conversation. But I think, one of the things I know, Don, you and I have talked about this too, is like, if you're doing this work, don't start with AI, right? Start doing the work on your own. Take that first standard, develop what that looks like, try a couple of them out. And then also use that, like we just said, as a check and balance, potentially, right? A thought for conversation. But then also just use it if you hit a roadblock. It's a thought partner. It's a brainstorming partner. So if you get to a standard and you're like, gosh, I don't even really know what that means. Like, let's pull it in to try to figure out some ideas that may be kind of that stepping stone. And, maybe we just need to have a whole conversation down the road. I think we need an episode on like AI in grading reform work and just like where it is a helpful tool and maybe where it should and shouldn't be used. But I definitely think that could be a future episode. Don, did you have something to add before we close out for today?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I just want to finish by saying, as we think about this entire theme of can't we just take someone else's prior standards, and whether we're trying to take someone else's or we're potentially trying to use AI or they were written for us because we're a super large district, I think it's just really important to remember, and I said this before, but it always comes back to the process, in my opinion, is just as important as the final product. And too often, people in districts, we think about just we're trying to get to that final product of what we're trying to create. So we try to rush through it. But this is the process that teachers go through and the benefits that students see in the long run about the teachers having a deep understanding of what the standards actually mean is it cannot be an understated benefit. Like it's equally as important as the actual final product that comes out of it, of the unpacked whatever version of the standard that we get. And so when we try to rush through it, we kind of gloss over the entire, like half of what the importance of doing it. So the process of doing it is just as important. If we skip that, we're missing half of the benefits, like the understanding. I always call it like the teacher education program. A lot of us, when we went to school, to college, we didn't go to school and we weren't trained on the standards that we're currently teaching. So the process of understanding, having a deep understanding of that, will benefit the students as much as the final product that we end up using. So I think that's really important to kind of finish.
And I think it's a fantastic summary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. That's a I feel like that was a perfect summary, a perfect closing thought. So Don and Garth, thank you so much for both of you joining today. In your insights for helping us understand why engaging ourselves in that work is so incredibly crucial. Thank you to all of you who are joining today. We hope you can join us at our next episode, which will be July 8th, 3 p.m. Central. And we are talking about show me some research that this grading reform stuff actually works. And we have a special guest with us that day, Matt Townsley, which he has done an immense amount of research in this field. So we're super excited to have him with us, some high energy. But we will see you guys all hopefully in July.